When the night has finally settled over everything you know, when even the restless hum of the city falls away and leaves only the hush of your own breathing, you find yourself at the threshold of a story you may not be prepared to hear. Imagine for a moment that you are standing on the battered deck of a small ferryboat, the chill wind off the Pacific sneaking under your coat. Ahead of you rises a dark silhouette, an island fortress that seems to repel every glimmer of light, as though it has chosen to hoard all darkness for itself. The sign over the dock once read, United States Penitentiary, Alcatraz Island, but no sign could ever capture the truth of what awaited the men ferried here in chains. Tonight, you and I are going to slip past the guards and the thick iron doors into the echoing halls and the tight cells where America's most infamous prisoners once paced. Some called Alcatraz the end of the line, others called it Hellcatraz. Almost no one called it home. But before we go deeper, before we pick apart the reality and the legend, let's pause here in this space between curiosity and dread to let the quiet surround us. Close your eyes if you'd like. Listen for the low murmur of water against the hull. Smell the salt and damp stone. Feel the uneasy thrill that comes from approaching a place designed to break men's bodies and their minds. You might wonder why this place existed at all. Why spend so much money and effort to build a prison on a rock surrounded by icy currents? The answer is as simple as it is unsettling. Because Alcatraz was meant to be inescapable. And that purpose shaped every corridor, every regulation, every hour of every day. If you listen closely, you'll hear the echo of steel doors slamming shut behind you one after another until there is nowhere left to run. It wasn't only a matter of security, it was psychological, this sense that you had already been forgotten before you ever arrived. Perhaps you've heard of Al Capone, the most notorious of Alcatraz's inmates. He came here in 1934 at the peak of his fame and the decline of his health. Other men arrived in Shackles, Machine Gun, Kelly, Robert Stroud, the Birdman and bank robbers so dangerous that even other prisoners feared them. But fame didn't count for much once you stepped onto the concrete dock. Every man was stripped of the name he'd built for himself and assigned a number. It was a small ritual of erasure repeated thousands of times, so that even the most notorious gangster would be reduced to an entry in a ledger and a set of folded clothes on a thin mattress. You might be tempted to think of Alcatraz as a purely modern invention, a fortress engineered by 20th century minds obsessed with control. But the idea of using isolation as punishment is older than the Republic itself. Long before the first stones were laid here, philosophers and wardens debated whether solitude could reform a man or simply crush him. Some argued that the silence would make a criminal reflect on his choices. Others suspected it would only breed madness. And so, when you hear the clank of keys or the shuffle of a guard's boots along the gallery, you're hearing the echoes of an argument that still hasn't been settled. The historians still debate whether Alcatraz was necessary or a cruel excess, a monument to fear more than to justice. If you were to step inside cell block D tonight, you'd find the most infamous cells, the solitary confinement units, the hole. Here a man could be locked away for weeks at a time, the only light a faint line beneath the steel door. There were no books, no conversation, no sense of time passing. Just the slow, creeping certainty that you were utterly alone. Inmates who survived the hole described it as a place where your mind would turn against you. Some said you could hear the walls breathing or feel the stones pressing closer. And though many prisoners swore they would never return, nearly all of them did eventually because rules were enforced with a cold perfection here. Imagine yourself walking that hallway passing those doors. You can feel the tension in the air as if the walls themselves remember every outburst, every plea for mercy. And still there is a deeper silence under all of it, the unspoken knowledge that escape was in theory impossible. Not because there were no plans. 14 escape attempts were recorded during Alcatraz's operation. Some were laughably inept. Others were so ingenious that to this day no one is sure whether the men made it to freedom or perished in the frigid water. You'll hear more about those later. For now, consider the daily life that never made headlines. The thin gruel of meals, the unrelenting inspections, the choreographed hours of labour and exercise. A man could serve 10 years here without ever touching another person or seeing the world beyond the yard. There is something unsettling about imagining yourself in that cell. The door closes behind you. The small window is too high to see through. The lights flicker and die, leaving you in darkness so complete that you can hear your heartbeat in your ears. You might think I could stand it for a day, But most men who tried would wake from the first night with trembling hands, unsure if the morning would ever come. So why would anyone build such a place? Part of the answer is simple deterrence. Alcatraz was meant to be the prison that ended all escapes, but the deeper truth is more complicated. It was a statement: there are some crimes society will never forgive, some people it will never trust again. That's why you're here tonight listening. Not because you admire the cruelty, but because there is a peculiar fascination in places that embody our collective fear. It's the same reason people visit the ruins of ancient dungeons or read about the Tower of London. We want to believe we could endure what others could not, that if the guards took us to a cell on Alcatraz we would walk out unchanged. But if you listen carefully past the rush of the tide, past the creaking of the old steel, you may hear something else, the voices of men who once believed that too. And here's the truth: you can leave this story whenever you wish. You can open your eyes, shake off the darkness and forget what it felt like to stand on that dock. But the men who were sent to Alcatraz had no such choice. Before we go further, let's pause here in this hush between chapters. The ferry rocks gently against the pier. The fog presses close. And you feel just for a moment what they must have felt, that you're very far from everything familiar, and that this night may never end. If you enjoy this space and wish to meet me here on other nights, please consider liking and following. We will have many more evenings to share these stories together. If you'd like, leave me a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always comforting to know how many others are awake in the quiet hours. And now the gates swing open. We step inside. When you pass the threshold and hear the gates close behind you, it is as though the air itself thickens. You're no longer merely a visitor or a curious onlooker. You're inside the belly of something designed to consume your sense of self. The echo of your footsteps seems louder here, bouncing off concrete and steel. In that moment you understand why some men claim the walls of Alcatraz seem to lean in closer with every passing day. Every new arrival was processed in a ritual that was equal parts practicality and humiliation. They were stripped, searched, and issued the standard uniform blue denim pants, and a coarse shirt stamped with their inmate number. Any trace of individuality, belongings, haircuts, even shoelaces was replaced with the bland uniformity of the institution. The message was unmistakable: nothing you were before mattered here. After this first stripping of identity, inmates were led down the main corridor known as Broadway. On either side, rows of cells stacked 3 tiers high stretched into the gloom. If you looked closely, you could see faces watching you. Some curious, some indifferent, some amused. It was a parade no one wanted to star in. The guards called it the $1 Million Walk, a mocking nod to the idea that every pair of eyes staring down on you belonged to men who had in their own ways cost society a fortune in grief. At the end of Broadway was the mess hall, perhaps the only place where a man could glimpse something approaching normalcy. 3 times a day, the clatter of trays and the smell of industrial coffee filled the air. But even here, order was absolute. Each prisoner had precisely 20 minutes to eat, and no talking was allowed unless you wished to spend your afternoon in isolation. You might think this was an overreaction after all. What harm could conversation do over a plate of beans and cornbread? But the wardens knew that rumour and grievance, when shared over meals, could ferment into something dangerous. When mealtime ended, the men filed back to their cells, each step measured and observed. A single misstep, a glance held too long, a murmured word could land you in solitary. The code of conduct was enforced so rigorously that even the guards sometimes struggled to remember every rule. But it was not only the rules that kept the prisoners in line. It was the unspoken truth that Alcatraz had been built to outlast their defiance. The place was engineered not just for confinement, but for a sort of slow erasure, a grinding away of any sense that you could change your circumstances. This was especially evident in the routines. Each morning began at 6:30 with the blare of a whistle. Men rose from their narrow cots and stood at attention waiting for the count. After roll call there was a short period for washing, though. Washing is generous for the tepid water that sputtered from the communal sinks. The showers too were an exercise in vulnerability. A line of naked men shuffled under sprays of hot water that might abruptly turn ice cold. No one complained because no one wanted to spend a night in the hole. Work assignments followed. Some prisoners worked in the laundry, scrubbing endless piles of uniforms. Others manned the sewing shop producing gloves for the military. The lucky ones earned kitchen duty where the hours were long, but the warmth and smells were at least a small comfort. Still, no matter where you laboured, you were never unobserved. Guards watched every movement, every tool, every glance. The sense of constant scrutiny was perhaps the most crushing aspect of life here. One former inmate described it this way: "You didn't feel like a person after a while. You felt like a problem they hadn't solved yet." It's a curious way to describe existence, like being an equation that must be reduced to zero. But Alcatraz was not only about deprivation, it was also about a peculiar brand of control that crept into even the smallest details. Take for example the rule about silence. From 1934 to 1937, absolute silence was enforced in the cell blocks. A man could not speak except during meals or recreation. The idea was that quiet would breed order. In practice, it bred resentment and a kind of madness. Some inmates resorted to tapping messages through the pipes. Others simply whispered through the bars, risking punishment for a few words of connection. You might ask yourself why such measures were deemed necessary, and here the history becomes a tangle of ambition and fear. The Bureau of Prisons wanted to create a model facility, one that would prove no criminal, however violent or cunning, was beyond containment. They built the prison to be escape-proof, but they also built it to be hope-proof. Because when hope dies, resistance often dies with it. That was the theory anyway, but if you believe that men will always find a way to rebel, you won't be surprised to learn that even in Alcatraz, defiance took root. The most famous instance came in May of 1946, the Battle of Alcatraz. A group of inmates managed to overpower guards, seize weapons, and barricade themselves in an attempt to force a breakout. For 2 days, gunfire echoed through the corridors. Smoke grenades were hurled into the cell blocks. When it was over, 3 inmates lay dead, and 2 correctional officers had lost their lives. The official reports described it as a failed escape attempt. But if you listen to the accounts of surviving inmates, you'll hear something different, that it was a last act of desperation from men who had come to believe that dying free was preferable to living in a cage. There is no easy way to measure what Alcatraz did to the men it housed. Some emerged hardened, determined never to return. Others left in worse condition than they arrived, sick in mind and body, incapable of rebuilding a life. And a few never left at all, their bones interred in the cemetery across the bay, or carried away by the tides after failed escapes. Perhaps the strangest detail, something that sounds almost too ironic to be true, is that many of the prison's staff lived on the island with their families. Children played baseball on the same grounds where prisoners took exercise. Wives hung laundry on lines that overlooked the recreation yard. From a distance, it must have looked like any other community, a handful of houses, a school, a grocery store. But at the heart of it was a fortress of concrete and iron filled with men who would never see the world beyond its walls again. And that more than anything is why Alcatraz remains lodged in our collective imagination, not because of its cruelty, but because of the eerie contrast, the ordinary and the monstrous sharing the same small island. The guards went home to dinner tables and birthday cakes while the inmates lay in their bunks counting the hours in the dark. Tonight, as you picture these hallways, so clean, so quiet, you might feel a chill that has nothing to do with the ocean wind. It is the chill of understanding how thin the line is between freedom and confinement, how easily a life can be reduced to a number stamped on a uniform. If you're still awake, take a moment to breathe. You're free to leave this place any time. The men who lived here were not. To understand why Alcatraz earned its reputation as the ultimate prison, you have to look beyond the steel bars and the high walls. You have to consider the strange geography that made the island itself a kind of accomplice to the institution. When you stand on the eastern edge of the yard and gaze out across the water, San Francisco looks impossibly close, just over 1.25 miles. You can almost imagine swimming there, finding freedom just beyond the fog. Almost. That illusion was part of the cruelty. The bay is colder than it appears, with currents that shift unpredictably, and tides that can strip the strength from your limbs in minutes. Prisoners joked that even if you were a strong swimmer, you'd arrive in the city as a blue frozen corpse. This was not entirely an exaggeration. Over the decades, dozens tried their luck. Most were hauled back ashore, shivering and defeated. A few disappeared completely, their ultimate fate never confirmed. The most notorious of these attempts took place in June 1962, when Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers executed one of the most audacious prison breaks in history. Their story has been told so often that it almost feels like legend. Yet the details are uncomfortably real. Months of preparation went into their plan. They used crude tools, stolen spoons, and improvised drill to widen the ventilation ducts in their cells. Each night they slipped papier-mâché grates into place so guards wouldn't notice the widening holes. To disguise their absence during bed checks, they crafted dummy heads out of soap toilet paper and hair clippings from the barber shop. It sounds like something from a movie, but it worked. On the night of June 11th, they wriggled through the ducts, climbed up a utility corridor and reached the roof. From there, they shimmied down a drainpipe, crossed the yard and vanished into the frigid black water. In the morning, the guards discovered their decoys and sounded the alarm. For weeks, an intense manhunt scoured the coastline and the bay. Bits of their makeshift raft, a patchwork of raincoats, washed ashore, but no bodies were ever recovered. Officially, the men were presumed drowned, though the FBI kept their files open for decades. Even now, if you visit Alcatraz, you can peer into their cells and see the holes behind the vents, a silent testimony to the most famous vanishing act the prison ever witnessed. The escape ignited the imagination of the public and humiliated the Bureau of Prisons. But it also underscored a fact that had long been whispered by those who worked on the rock Alcatraz was no longer sustainable. By the early 1960s, the facility was crumbling from saltwater corrosion. The cost of maintaining it, estimated at 3 times higher than any other federal prison, was draining the federal budget. And so, less than a year after the escape, the government announced that Alcatraz would close. On March 21, 1963, the final group of prisoners was loaded onto a boat and ferried to other institutions. The last guard locked the main gate, turned the key and walked away. For the first time in decades, the cell house was silent. It stayed that way for years, just gulls and wind and the slow decay of iron and concrete. Yet the closure did not erase the myths. If anything, the end of Alcatraz's tenure as a penitentiary only deepened the fascination. People wanted to know what it had really been like. The stories trickled out, some verified, some embroidered by time and retelling. There were accounts of the D block where solitary confinement cells were so dark a man could not see his own hands. Tales of inmates tapping secret messages through pipes, or smuggling contraband in the hems of laundry. And inevitably rumours of ghosts. You might scoff at that last detail, ghost really. But spend an evening in the empty cell house, and you may understand why even seasoned rangers admit that Alcatraz has a presence. When night falls and the corridors fill with shadows, it is easy to imagine the residual energy of thousands of men whose lives unfolded here mostly in misery. One of the more unsettling stories centres on cell 14D, the most dreaded solitary cell on the island. Inmates called it the Hole. According to legend, a prisoner once began screaming in the dark, insisting that something with glowing eyes was in the cell with him. The guards ignored him. In the morning he was found dead, a look of terror frozen on his face. Was it true? The records offer no confirmation, but visitors to this day claim to feel cold spots and hear inexplicable noises when they linger near 14D. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Alcatraz has nothing to do with the supernatural. It is the simple fact that for most of its existence, the prison was a monument to the idea that some people cannot be redeemed, only contained. Even in the 1950s and 60s, when other prisons experimented with rehabilitation programs, Alcatraz remained steadfast in its philosophy of isolation and control. Education was minimal, privileges strictly limited. The notion of correction was little more than a euphemism. Men came here to be broken of hope, not to be prepared for re-entry into society. This philosophy exacted a price. When inmates were paroled or transferred, they often struggled to adjust to less restrictive institutions. Some committed new crimes, almost immediately unable to adapt to environments where they were expected to make choices for themselves. Others simply withdrew their capacity for trust and connection, so thoroughly eroded that they never rebuilt a normal life. Today, Alcatraz has become a destination for tourists. Ferries carry visitors across the bay, past the same treacherous currents that once kept prisoners penned in. As you walk through the cell house, audio guides narrate the daily routines and the famous escapes. You can stand in the recreation yard and look across the water to the city just as the inmates once did. It is a strange experience, part historical lesson, part voyeuristic thrill. And yet in these restored spaces it is easy to forget the toll that living here extracted. You see the bare bunks and the tiny cells, but you don't hear the relentless noise of clanging doors and shouted orders. You don't feel the fatigue of years spent under fluorescent lights, or the peculiar loneliness of being so close to freedom. You can almost touch it, knowing you will never have it. If you ever find yourself walking those halls, pause for a moment. Close your eyes and imagine the hundreds of men who lay awake at night, straining to hear the distant sounds of a world that had moved on without them. Imagine the weight of each day identical to the one before, and ask yourself, how long would it take for you to forget who you were before you came here? But more than any escape or ghost story is the true horror of Alcatraz. Not the walls, not the guards, not even the icy water, but the way it could make a person disappear long before their body left the island. If you could have strolled through Alcatraz in its heyday, you'd have seen a carefully regulated choreography of daily routines. Nothing was left to chance. Every action from the hour prisoners rose to the precise way they folded their blankets was designed to enforce control and to remind them that nothing belonged to them anymore, not even time. The day began early around 6:30 a.m, when the guards' boots echoed along the tier walkways and electric lights flickered to life. Prisoners were expected to make their beds with military precision, tucking sheets so tight that a quarter would bounce if dropped on the blanket. Any deviation earned demerits, and too many could lead to solitary confinement. Breakfast was a short walk away in the dining hall, perhaps the most dangerous room in the prison. Imagine 250 men, many convicted murderers, sitting shoulder to shoulder with metal cutlery in hand. A massive tear gas canister was bolted to the ceiling, ready to flood the room if a fight erupted. Guards watched from catwalks with rifles at the ready. The menu wasn't extravagant, but compared to other prisons of the era, it was surprisingly decent. Fresh bread oatmeal, sometimes bacon, Warden Johnston. The first warden insisted that decent food reduced trouble. He was probably right. After breakfast, prisoners moved in ordered columns to their work assignments. Unlike many penitentiaries, Alcatraz functioned almost like a factory. Some men worked in the laundry, cleaning vast loads of military uniforms shipped from bases around the west coast. Others laboured in the mat shop, sewing cushions for ships and barracks. The noise in these workshops could be deafening. Industrial machines roared, steam hissed, and the clatter of work drowned out attempts at conversation. But if you were assigned to the Model Industries building, you might have found the labour almost soothing a repetitive monotony that let your mind wander. You might have paused now and then to glance out the windows at the sparkling bay, pretending for a moment you weren't surrounded by locked doors and armed guards. Some inmates said it was those glimpses of the outside that kept them sane. Others claimed it was precisely what drove them mad. Lunch was a short affair, served at 11:20 sharp. Each prisoner had 20 minutes to eat before returning to work. Inmates learned quickly not to waste time or food. If you finished early, you sat silently with your hands visible on the table. If you broke the rules, talking without permission, stealing an extra roll, you risked being sent to isolation. Recreation time came in the afternoon, but it wasn't the casual, sprawling freedom you might imagine. A narrow yard enclosed by high walls offered a view of the skyline. You could see the Oakland docks or watch sailboats drift by. Some men played baseball or exercised on the pull-up bars. Others walked in slow loops, always under the watchful eye of guards in the towers. One small mercy inmates were allowed to visit the library. Though they could not enter the shelves themselves, books were requested via catalogue, and delivered to cells. Alcatraz had a surprisingly rich collection. There were classics, technical manuals, even National Geographic back issues. For a few minutes you could immerse yourself in a story that had nothing to do with prison. But the library was also a reminder. You could read about the world, but you couldn't participate in it. You might study a carpentry manual and imagine building a house. You might leaf through photographs of Paris and think about wide boulevards and warm bakeries. When you closed the book, the same cold bars stared back at you. By 4:50 p.m, dinner was served. It looked much like lunch, though perhaps a little heartier chili stews a piece of pie if you were lucky. After that, inmates filed back to their cells for counter-ritual repeated 5 times a day. The guards walked the tiers, checking each man's face and comparing it to the roster. Only when every prisoner was accounted for did the cell block settle into its long night. The hours after lockup were some of the hardest. Lights out came at 9:30 p.m, but before then you had little to do but read, write letters, or stare at the ceiling. Some prisoners kept radios, listening to music piped in from the mainland, small reminders of life beyond the walls. It was in those quiet hours that the mental strain of Alcatraz weighed most heavily. You could hear the wind shrieking through the cracks in the walls or the foghorn bleating from the bay. If you were housed on the west side, you could sometimes hear laughter drifting across the water from Fisherman's Wharf. The city was so close you could almost reach it, but that proximity only deepened the sense of isolation. Occasionally the monotony was broken by sudden violence. The Battle of Alcatraz in 1946 was the most infamous incident. 6 inmates attempted a daring escape, overpowering guards and seizing weapons. The standoff lasted 2 days. Marines were called in to retake the cell block. By the end, 3 prisoners were dead and 2 were later executed. Even in defeat, their rebellion left a scar on the institution's psyche. But not all stories from Alcatraz were marked by bloodshed. Some were stranger, almost absurd. There was the inmate who bred canaries in his cell, hundreds of tiny birds there singing incongruously cheerful. There were rumours of elaborate chess tournaments conducted by shouting moves through air vents, and there were the letters, thousands of them sent and received under the watchful eye of censors. Every one of those details, each ritual, each peculiar habit contributed to the atmosphere that made Alcatraz so notorious. It wasn't just the brutality of the place. It was the slow erosion of identity, the transformation of men into numbers and routines. When the prison finally closed, many inmates transferred to other facilities, described a profound disorientation. One man reportedly burst into tears upon arriving at Leavenworth, unable to comprehend that he was allowed to walk to the bathroom without an escort. Another confessed that he missed the predictability of the rock. That's the paradox of Alcatraz. It was designed to crush hope, but in doing so, it taught men to crave even the smallest freedoms. It is easy now to think of Alcatraz as an artifact, a curiosity from an earlier era of American punishment. But in the 1930s and 1940s, it was very much alive, and its reputation was not simply a matter of myth. Inside those walls, life was a continuous low-grade test of sanity, and nowhere was this more evident than in the silence that ruled the cells. Officially, Alcatraz was known as a maximum security, minimum privilege institution, but that phrasing only hinted at what it felt like to live there day after day. For many inmates, the most oppressive rule was the one about talking outside recreation periods and work assignments. Prisoners were forbidden to speak above a whisper. This so-called rule of silence was intended to prevent conspiracies, reduce conflicts, and keep order. The effect, however, was more psychological than logistical. Imagine spending years in a place where you could not easily laugh, complain, or confide, where every word you uttered might bring a reprimand or punishment. Over time, the absence of ordinary conversation eroded men's sense of self. Some adapted by developing elaborate systems of communication. They learned to mouth silent sentences behind their hands or tapped codes on the plumbing that connected the cells. Others simply gave up trying. They turned inward, becoming as blank and impassive as the concrete walls around them. In a memoir written decades later, former inmate Jim Quillen described how the silence could feel heavier than any chain. You could go days without hearing your own voice, he wrote, and then when you did speak, it startled you. The silence was punctuated, of course, by sounds no one could avoid. The clanging of cell doors as they were slammed shut each evening, the guards' keys rattling on steel belts, the endless thrum of the bay winds. Some nights the foghorn was so loud it seemed to pulse through the walls themselves. Prisoners claimed you could feel it in your bones, a kind of low, mournful note that reminded you the world outside was moving on without you. Not all inmates experienced the silence the same way. A few found solace in it, a kind of enforced retreat that allowed them to think, read, and reflect. For others, it was an ongoing torment. Some men paced their cells until their feet blistered. Others lay in bed, staring at the ceiling for hours, convinced the paint was crawling. There were stories, some true, some exaggerated, of prisoners who began to talk to themselves so persistently that they forgot how to address another person. One of the more peculiar cases was that of a prisoner who insisted he could hear music in the walls. When he was finally transferred to a psychiatric hospital, he claimed the songs were proof he had been chosen for a special mission. The silence was only one part of the discipline. At Alcatraz, almost every aspect of existence was regulated. Clothing was standardized. Movement was choreographed. Even small gestures where you rested your hands, how you folded your clothes were subject to inspection. Each man was assigned a number. For the duration of his sentence, that number became his primary identity. Letters to family were addressed not to a name, but to an identification string, often beginning with the letters AZ. Many inmates kept a small mirror tacked to the wall above the sink. It was the only way they could see themselves, and over time even that reflection could feel alien. Men reported watching their faces change without quite recognizing who they were becoming. Some guards understood the toll this took. Others embraced it as the price of discipline. They called prisoners fellows or boys, terms meant to sound casual, but always tinged with condescension. The unspoken message was clear. You do not belong to yourself here. You belong to the rock. And then there were the rumours, stories passed in whispers about who had cracked and who was close. One tale told of an inmate who spent weeks carving a tiny wooden figure, only to destroy it in a fit of rage when he was ordered to sweep his cell. Another man reportedly stopped responding to his own name and would only answer to his number. These stories circulated because they expressed something everyone felt, that Alcatraz was designed to be a place where a person could vanish even without ever leaving his cell. The peculiar irony was that just beyond those thick walls, the most beautiful bay on the Pacific coast shimmered day and night. If you were lucky enough to have a cell on the western side, you could sometimes catch glimpses of sailboats gliding past. You might even hear music drifting across the water jazz and swing tunes played at the dance clubs on Fisherman's Wharf. That contrast, the grim interior and the dazzling world just out of reach, haunted many inmates more than any punishment. It was a daily reminder of how much they had lost and how little chance there was of ever getting it back. The poet Dylan Thomas once wrote that rage against the dying of the light. But in Alcatraz, many inmates raged against something subtler, the dying of the self, the slow erosion of all the small human impulses, jokes, complaints, gestures of camaraderie that make a person feel alive. Over time, the silence and the sameness wore grooves in the mind. Some prisoners adapted by inventing elaborate mental rituals. They memorized pages of books, recited multiplication tables, or replayed memories of their childhood in perfect detail. Others simply went quiet inside, becoming shadows of the men who had arrived. That is why, when you hear people say Alcatraz wasn't really that bad after all, no one was tortured there, you might gently disagree. Because the reality was more insidious, Alcatraz didn't need overt brutality to break a person. Its architecture and its rules were enough. In the end, it was not the stone walls alone that made the place so infamous. It was what those walls did to the voices inside them, how they muffled, stifled, and finally silenced the parts of a man that could not be chained. Even in a place as strictly regimented as Alcatraz, there were moments when the daily routine was disrupted, moments when the careful choreography of punishment slipped, and something raw emerged. You might think of escapes and riots, but one of the most fascinating examples was far quieter: the hunger strikes. Food was both a necessity and a fragile privilege. Inmates who followed the rules were entitled to 3 meals a day served in the vast mess hall that occupied much of the main building. On paper, the menu sounded almost generous: oatmeal and toast in the morning stews, or meats at lunch and dinner, canned fruit for dessert. But the reality was less comforting. The food, though rarely outright spoiled, was monotonous. The bread was dense and stale by midday. Vegetables came in industrial-sized cans, their colour and flavour long departed. On holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, the kitchen staff sometimes prepared turkey or pie, but on most days the meals were designed for efficiency, not pleasure. For the men inside the mess hall was more than just a place to eat. It was the only communal space where they were allowed to gather in large numbers. The room itself was cavernous, with rows of steel tables and benches bolted to the floor. In the centre aisle, a single guard station stood elevated, providing a clear view of every plate and every hand. Before each meal, the prisoners lined up outside the hall, waiting for the steel doors to open. Once inside, they filed past a long counter, where cooks ladled out portions. Talking was permitted, but only in hushed tones. The guards stood watch, scanning for signs of defiance, and it was in this setting that some of the most peculiar and telling confrontations occurred. Consider this: you are an inmate, and the food in front of you is not merely bland, it feels like an extension of your punishment. Eating becomes another reminder that you have no control, so when tempers flared, it often wasn't about the meal itself, it was about dignity. In 1936, for example, a dispute erupted over a batch of beans that inmates claimed were spoiled. A group of prisoners refused to eat. At first, the guards dismissed their complaints as trivial, but the refusal spread, and soon dozens of men were leaving their trays untouched. For administrators, a hunger strike was a direct challenge to authority. The warden, James Johnston, was particularly sensitive to any hint that he was losing control. He believed, as many did at the time, that strict discipline was the only way to maintain order. So when the strike continued for several days, Johnston ordered the men confined to their cells on restricted rations, bread and water, nothing more. For some, the point had been made, and they reluctantly resumed eating. Others held out, growing weaker and more determined by the hour. There is something revealing in that image: men who had no power over their schedules, their voices, or their futures, asserting the only control left to them. It was a desperate kind of autonomy, one that exacted a steep price. In a few cases, the hunger strikers collapsed from dehydration. They were taken to the infirmary, where nurses tried to rehydrate them. Even then, many refused to eat unless their grievances were addressed. Some historians still debate whether the warden quietly replaced the offending beans or simply waited for the protest to burn itself out. But the hunger strikes didn't always start with spoiled food. Sometimes they were about other rules, limits on mail, on exercise, or on access to books. Any of these could trigger a protest, because each was another tiny reminder that the men were not free in even the smallest details of their lives. The hunger strikes also demonstrated something the administration found unsettling: solidarity. In a place designed to isolate, punish, and demoralize the inmates, occasionally managed to act together. The threat of collective defiance was always present like a low hum in the background of the institution's routines. That is why the mess hall was considered one of the most dangerous places in the prison. Each meal was an opportunity for tension to flare into violence. To minimize this risk, guards implemented rituals. Each man carried his tray to a designated seat. If an argument broke out, the signal was simple and unmistakable: a shrill whistle that brought every inmate to immediate attention. No one was permitted to stand up or move until the disturbance was contained. Perhaps the most famous story about the mess hall involved the so-called Battle of Alcatraz, the attempted breakout in 1946. Though the uprising began in a cell block, some of the plans were whispered in the mess hall over countless breakfasts and dinners. The conspirators watched the guards' habits, noted when the keys were exchanged, and debated which corridors would be easiest to control. It is ironic in retrospect that the place where men were most watched was also the place where conspiracies took shape. But perhaps it is not so surprising. After all, when you gather hundreds of people in one room, people whose freedom has been stripped away, seeds of rebellion will eventually take root. Even without violence, the mess hall could feel like a theatre of humiliation. Prisoners recalled how the guards sometimes searched them as they left, running gloved hands across their clothing, shaking out napkins, examining pockets. The smallest infraction, a crust of bread tucked away for later, could result in punishment. For some inmates, these inspections were worse than the food itself. They were reminders that nothing was truly theirs, not even the right to carry a scrap of bread back to a cell. Yet the hunger strikes and protests, small though they might seem, were acts of resistance that defied Alcatraz's reputation as unbreakable. They showed that even in the most controlled environments, human beings will look for a way to assert their will. When people romanticize Alcatraz, now turning it into a tourist attraction, a backdrop for thrillers, they often overlook the ordinary humiliations that defined life there. The hunger strikes are instructive because they reveal something deeper than the legends. A story not about grand escapes, but about the quiet insistence on being treated as more than a number. In the end, those protests rarely succeeded in changing policy. The warden remained firm, the rules stayed in place. But for the men who participated, it was enough to have made their voices heard, even in a place built to smother them. It was their way of saying, you can cage our bodies, but you cannot fully command our hunger or our refusal. If you stand on the Alcatraz dock today with the breeze off San Francisco Bay ruffling your jacket, it's easy to forget that the island was once a fortress of isolation. Tour guides point out the cracked walls and the barred windows, but what's harder to see are the long years when men inside were cut off from everything that made them human. Solitary confinement was one of Alcatraz's defining tools. To the administration, it was not merely a punishment, but a methodical strategy to break resistance before it could grow. They called it segregation, but inmates knew it by another name: the hole. The hole occupied the lowest level of B and D blocks. There were several types of isolation cells. The most notorious were the windowless steel chambers that could be sealed in total darkness. The men who ended up there often did so for refusing orders, attacking a guard, or sometimes merely protesting the quality of food or treatment. Imagine being escorted down the echoing corridor, every footstep of the guards sounding like a reminder that you were no longer part of the world. At the entrance to the hole there was a heavy door, double reinforced and fitted with a thick lock. Once it shut behind you, the air changed, growing damp and close. Inside the cell measured about 5 by 9 feet. No light seeped in from the corridor. The walls were coated in flaking paint that smelled of mildew. In the earliest years, the cell contained only a thin mattress that was removed during the day. Later, some men were left with nothing but the cold concrete floor. For meals, a guard would open a small slot and push in a metal tray. There was no clock, no window, nothing to mark the hours except your own thoughts. One prisoner later recalled how after 3 days in the hole, he began to hear a faint ringing in his ears, as though the darkness itself was singing to him. Another described feeling the walls breathe in and out, an illusion born of hunger and dread. It is not difficult to understand why the hole became legendary in the prison's folklore. The administration insisted it was necessary to maintain discipline. Without solitary confinement, they argued the most dangerous inmates would feel emboldened to undermine authority. But even among guards there were disagreements. Some believed it was overused. Others worried that a man could emerge from the hole less compliant, not more. The longest known stretches in total darkness lasted up to 19 days, while regulations technically limited stays to shorter intervals in practice. Warden discretion was absolute. The official policy stated that no cruel or unusual punishment was permitted. But if you asked the men who survived the hole whether it was cruel, the answer was always the same. Consider this detail: a prisoner sent to the hole often had to strip naked. If he was fortunate, he received a canvas coverall. Otherwise he sat in the cold without clothing. There was a drain in the floor that served as the toilet, and it could be flushed only from the corridor. Each day the guards would open the hatch and peer inside, counting heads and checking for contraband. But otherwise they left you alone hour after hour. Historians have long debated whether the routine of solitary confinement achieved its intended purpose. Some inmates did emerge subdued, but many more left the hole determined never to return, and some became more dangerous, not less. One of the most unsettling stories comes from a man named Henry Young. He was sent to Alcatraz for bank robbery, but it was his time in the hole that would shape the rest of his life. After months of repeated solitary confinement, Young attacked and killed another inmate. His defence at trial was simple: prolonged isolation had driven him to madness. When news of the case reached the newspapers, it sparked public outrage. For a brief moment, Americans glimpsed the cost of a system that prized control above everything else, and yet the regime continued. The official record shows that the hole was not always empty. During the peak years of Alcatraz, there were seldom fewer than a handful of men confined there. Some were placed in solitary for major offences, but many more were punished for small infractions: a shouted insult, a refusal to stand during an argument over rations. Imagine the psychological toll of that uncertainty, never knowing whether today's anger or frustration might end with the click of a steel door behind you. Some inmates developed rituals to endure the darkness. A few would exercise by walking in small circles until they were exhausted. Others recited poetry or imaginary conversations. One man claimed he could replay entire baseball games in his memory batter by batter, inning by inning, just to keep himself sane. But for many, the darkness seeped under their skin. Sleep came in fits, appetite vanished. Time stretched and warped until you began to wonder if you were still the same person who had walked in. Years later, when the prison closed, the cells in the hole were left almost exactly as they had been. The steel doors still swing on their hinges. The air still smells of old paint and salt. Tourists can walk past the thresholds and peer inside, imagining what it might have felt like. But imagination is not the same as experience. No audio recording or historical photograph can fully convey the oppressive silence. No tour guide can recreate the moment when a man realized he could scream as loud as he liked, and no one would hear him. Perhaps that is the truest measure of what the hole represented: not just the absence of light or comfort, but the deliberate stripping away of self. For all its reputation as an escape-proof fortress, Alcatraz never really needed miles of water or barbed wire to keep men inside. The hole did the work just as effectively. It persuaded prisoners that even if they survived the ordeal, they would emerge diminished, less willing to challenge the system again. And yet not everyone was broken. Some inmates returned to their cells hardened by the ordeal, more certain than ever that the prison could take everything but their will. The hole was a paradox, a place designed to enforce order, yet one that sometimes ceded the very defiance it sought to crush. In the quiet of those concrete walls, every man confronted the same question: who are you when there is no one left to see you? The clanging gate slams shut behind you, and a hush falls over the yard. You've returned from the hole if you were lucky enough to leave it, but your life in Alcatraz is still anything but ordinary. The next morning you might find yourself assigned to the laundry, a cavernous room that always smelled of soap and steam, or to the tailor shop, or to the industries building where men stitched gloves, assembled furniture and packed military supplies. Work was the constant hum in the background of every prisoner's day. Alcatraz officials believed that labour was not merely punishment but therapy, a structured routine that would keep men's minds from wandering into rebellion. But in practice the system was more complicated. Imagine stepping into the laundry before dawn. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead. Dozens of men stand in rows sorting endless piles of clothing uniforms, stained with sweat towels crusted with salt from the bay air. The heat soaks your skin, and the hiss of steam presses against your eardrums until it feels like the room itself is breathing. This was the work that filled the hour's work you had to perform with mechanical focus. A slip of inattention might earn a reprimand, a mark on your record, or worse, an accusation that you were sabotaging the operation. Yet the labour was not always as dull as it seemed. Some inmates developed intricate systems of communication, passing messages tucked into seams of laundry or whispered while lifting crates. The industry's building in particular was notorious for hidden notes that travelled from one workbench to another. Prisoners learned to read each other's faces. A flicker of the eyes, a gesture too precise to be accidental, these became signals as clear as any spoken word. Among the most sought-after assignments was the furniture shop. Men there could craft wooden pieces for government offices, earning small privileges for skilled work. The environment was quieter than the laundry, and less oppressive than the glove shop. But it still carried the same unspoken warning: this place belonged to the prison. You were here because you had been broken out of your life and slotted into a machine that measured you by your output. And then there were the meals, an experience that many inmates would later describe as both the highlight and the low point of each day. The dining hall, with its rows of steel tables and bolted-down chairs, operated on a rigid schedule. You lined up, filed in, took a seat and waited for the signal to begin eating. No talking without permission, no standing up before the count was complete. The food itself was famously better than in many other prisons. Alcatraz wanted no riots over starvation. Breakfast might be oatmeal and eggs. Lunch a slice of meatloaf with potatoes, dinner stewed vegetables and bread, but the monotony weighed on you. One inmate joked that he could tell what day of the week it was just by the taste of the beans. Over everything hovered an atmosphere of tense predictability. Everyone knew that a single outbreak of violence could turn the dining hall into a death trap. Guards stood ready with tear gas canisters and rifles in the gun galleries. This fear was not imaginary. On more than one occasion, fights did erupt, swift, explosive, and sometimes fatal. It is in these routines, work meals counts, that you see the deeper philosophy of Alcatraz: to deny individuality wherever possible, to subsume each man into the pattern of the institution. But even under this pressure, inmates found ways to assert small fragments of identity. Some men became known for their quiet generosity, offering a spare cigarette or a word of encouragement. Others for their defiance, refusing to bow their heads when a guard passed. One of the more peculiar traditions was the ritual of the window gaze. If you were lucky enough to be assigned to a work detail on the upper floors, you might get a glimpse of San Francisco across the water, the city glinting in the sun so close it felt like you could almost touch it. A few prisoners claimed that on clear days you could hear music drifting from the docks, a dance band or a radio playing some bright, jaunty tune just enough to remind you that life was still happening out there. For some, these glimpses were torture. They preferred to keep their eyes fixed on their tasks to avoid the ache of longing, but others treasured the moments, carrying them like a secret talisman against despair. Historians have written about this duality, the way Alcatraz simultaneously crushed and preserved fragments of human spirit. The official record notes that the prison ran on schedules and rules, but the personal accounts tell another story of tiny rebellions, friendships formed in whispers, and a stubborn refusal to forget that you were more than your number. One of the strangest facts about Alcatraz is how many men later described it as the most orderly prison they'd known, and yet also the loneliest. The regime of work and silence was in its way more corrosive than open violence. It was here, amid the regulated chaos of labour and meal counts, that many inmates learned a new form of endurance: the ability to live inside a story you did not choose, to keep a part of yourself hidden from the machinery grinding all around you. Consider the case of Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz. Though he never kept birds on the island, he'd raised canaries at Leavenworth before his transfer. Stroud became a symbol of how a man might hold on to an interior life. He spent years in segregation, studying law and writing manuscripts on ornithology, his mind working in defiance of the walls. Guards said he was the most dangerous man in the prison, not because he was violent though he was, but because he refused to be reduced to silence. And then there were men like Clarence Carnes, who arrived at Alcatraz as the youngest inmate ever to be sent there, only 18 years old. He survived years of confinement and even took part in the Battle of Alcatraz uprising. But in the long quiet stretches between drama, he learned to carry himself through the workdays with a kind of weary acceptance. If you were to ask him or any of the others whether the routines of Alcatraz broke them, you'd get an answer as complex as the prison itself. They were Some would say yes, others would shrug as if to admit that the question itself didn't matter anymore. Because in the end, you did what you had to do, you worked, you ate, you counted off the hours until you could sleep, and then you did it again. That was life in Alcatraz. The sun sets behind the silhouette of San Francisco, and as the long shadows crawl across the yard, the lights in Alcatraz flicker on harsh pale beams that seem to bleach out every trace of individuality. You've survived another day of the same routines, but dusk brings its own particular anxieties. Nighttime in Alcatraz was when the quiet turned oppressive, when your thoughts grew louder, simply because there was nothing left to distract you. Imagine yourself in your cell, a small rectangle of concrete and steel. You have a narrow bunk bolted to the wall, a thin mattress that does little to soften the chill, and a stainless steel toilet in the corner. A single shelf holds whatever possessions the warden has deemed acceptable, a few books, perhaps a photograph, a bar of soap. When you lay back on your pillow, you can hear the ocean pushing against the rocks far below, as if the island itself is exhaling in the darkness. This was the hour when many prisoners felt the weight of what the authorities called the treatment. That word, so bureaucratic and bloodless, simply meant that you were being moulded into the ideal inmate, silent, compliant, forgotten. But men are stubborn creatures. Some found a way to smuggle in contraband, an extra pencil, a deck of cards, a scrap of paper to write messages on. Others developed elaborate codes tapping against the plumbing pipes to share a word or a joke with the next cell over. A guard passing down the tier might hear the faintest rhythm, 3 taps, then 2, then a pause. To the untrained ear it was just the pipes settling, but to the men inside it was proof that someone was still listening, and sometimes in those hours between lights out and dawn the ghosts of the prison came to visit. Not literal ghosts, though more than one inmate swore they'd seen shapes in the corridor or heard the echo of footsteps when no one was there but the ghosts of your own regrets. Every conviction carried a story, and in the dark there was no escaping the replay. Some men lay awake remembering the last conversation they'd had with their mothers. Others pictured the courtroom where their sentences had been read. A few simply counted. They counted the days served, the days remaining, the years lost to the machine of punishment. It said that if you listened closely, you could hear the low murmur of voices drifting up through the ventilation grates. Hushed conversations, half-formed prayers, the occasional note of a song. Even in a place designed to strip away humanity, the impulse to reach out persisted. One of the stranger traditions was what inmates called the midnight confession. When the lights were out and the guards had retreated to their stations, a prisoner might whisper his secrets into the darkness. Not because he expected absolution, but because saying it aloud just once made it feel less poisonous. Years later, some of those confessions would resurface in memoirs and interviews. A man would recall how he admitted to a neighbour he'd never seen that he still missed his children. Another would describe confessing a crime he hadn't even been charged with simply because the silence was too heavy to bear alone. Historians have wondered whether this ritual was unique to Alcatraz or simply a product of long confinement. Was it a failure of discipline or an inevitable eruption of humanity? No one can say for sure. What is certain is that the prison was both a fortress and a crucible. The same walls that prevented escape also trapped every thought, amplifying it, until there was nowhere left to hide from yourself. And then there was the music. Alcatraz allowed radios in certain cell blocks, and on clear nights you could tune into dance bands playing live across the bay. Imagine it. You're lying on your bunk staring at the ceiling. The faint crackle of the broadcast drifts through the corridor. Trumpets and violins conjure a world that has nothing to do with iron bars. For a few minutes you're no longer an inmate. You are a listener, a witness to beauty. It didn't last, of course. The guards would announce lights out, the radios clicked off, and the music vanished as if it had never been. But the memory lingered. Some men claimed those stolen moments were what kept them sane. Others argued that they only made the return to silence more brutal. Either way, the ritual of listening became a kind of collective dream, a reminder that the outside world still existed, even if you could no longer touch it. There were other sounds too, the creak of steel doors, the shuffle of boots on concrete, the metallic rasp of keys turning in locks. Each noise carried meaning, and you learned to interpret them the way a mariner reads the weather. A sudden burst of shouting, trouble in another block, a long, uninterrupted quiet, a search in progress, everyone waiting to see whose cell would be torn apart. And always beneath everything, the rhythmic churn of the tide against the cliffs, a reminder that escape was not only improbable, but fatal. Despite this, men still tried. Throughout its history, Alcatraz witnessed 14 known escape attempts. Some were desperate and ill-prepared, ending in immediate recapture or death. Others were astonishingly sophisticated, involving months of planning stolen tools and decoy dummies placed in bunks to fool the guards. But that's a story for another time. Tonight you're simply here alone in a cell that feels too small to contain all the memories pressing against you. You breathe in the cold salt air leaking through the seams of the window. You listen to the final count echoing down the tiers, and you wonder how many more nights it will take before you forget the sound of your own voice. Because in Alcatraz, silence wasn't just a condition. It was a sentence all its own. Daylight in Alcatraz was never truly bright. Even at noon, when the California sun beat down on the city across the bay, the cell house seemed to exist in a permanent state of dimness, as if the concrete itself absorbed and dulled the light. You wake to the same sounds as every morning, the buzz of the fluorescent fixtures, the clatter of metal trays being stacked in the kitchen, the echoing shouts of guards announcing count. But today is different. Today is inspection day. On these mornings, every inmate understood that nothing was truly private. Not the few belongings you'd been allowed to keep, not the hidden corners of your mattress, not even your memories. The guard pauses at your cell, tapping the bars with his baton. The sound rings out like a challenge. Step back, he orders. You obey because in Alcatraz disobedience always costs more than you can afford. He unlocks the door and you watch as he begins his search. Every sheet is lifted, every pocket turned inside out. He picks up a dog-eared book and flips through its pages looking for notes scratched between the lines. Nothing escapes his attention. It's not that he expects to find a weapon or an escape plan every time. Most of the time inspections were more psychological than practical. It was a reminder you have no place here that belongs only to you. Some inmates tried to resist this erosion of privacy by carving tiny marks into the concrete. Initials, dates, small symbols that meant something only to them. A few grew attached to the objects they'd managed to keep. A worn deck of cards, a smuggled photograph. Even a chipped mug could feel like an anchor, but on inspection day any of those treasures could be confiscated without explanation. There were stories of men who'd broken down sobbing when their few keepsakes disappeared. Others grew silent, their faces hardening as though they'd buried one more piece of themselves. It might seem trivial to an outsider. What difference does a mug make in a prison like Alcatraz? But here every scrap of familiarity mattered. When the search is done, the guard gives you a nod and you step back into your cell. He locks the door with a sharp click that seems to echo through your chest. The routine continues down the tiered door after door, life after life, inspected and reduced to inventory. And then, as if nothing has happened, the day goes on. Meals in the mess hall were another theatre of order. You would file in line your tray held flat against your stomach and move past the serving counter. The menu never varied much. Beans, stew, bread, coffee. Some men claimed Alcatraz's food was better than other prisons, a small consolation considering the rest. But even mealtime had its dangers. You took your seat in silence, eyes on your plate, careful not to stare at anyone too long. A single wrong look could spark an argument, and in Alcatraz arguments sometimes ended with a shiv pulled from a sleeve. More than once the mess hall erupted into sudden violence, an overturned table. A guard's baton raised the sickening thud of a body hitting the floor. Afterward the survivors would return to their cells as if nothing had happened, because in here nothing was permitted to interrupt the routine. Perhaps the most famous symbol of Alcatraz's relentless order was the shower room. The showers were communal, a long line of spigots mounted over bare concrete. You would strip in front of everyone, your clothes folded and placed in a numbered bin. Steam rose in thick clouds as dozens of men stepped under the water. The heat was always turned high, an intentional strategy to discourage any fantasies about escaping through the freezing bay. You scrubbed yourself clean with the institutional soap, aware of the dozens of eyes that might or might not be watching. When you were done, you'd step into a drafty corridor to collect your uniform again. Some prisoners called the showers the Great Equalizer. No matter who you were on the outside, a gangster, a thief, a man with nothing here, you were simply another body under the spray. And when the day finally ended, you would lie on your bunk and remember that no matter what small scraps of comfort you'd managed to salvage, a book, a song, a moment of conversation, none of it belonged to you. It could all be taken in an instant. That was the real power of Alcatraz, not just the walls and the guards, but the slow, methodical erosion of your sense of self. Over the years, some men adapted. They became model inmates, keeping their cells immaculate, never speaking out of turn. Others resisted in small ways: a smuggled note, a hidden deck of cards, a whispered joke that risked punishment. A few simply broke. One of the most chilling stories comes from an inmate who later described his last weeks on the island. He said that he began to feel as though the walls were moving closer every night, as if the prison itself were pressing in on him. Each morning he would wake to find fresh cracks in the concrete cracks that no one else could see. Eventually he was transferred to the psychiatric ward, and yet even there he claimed he could hear the ocean whispering through the walls, reminding him that he was never going to leave. Historians still debate whether this was madness or simply the logical result of total isolation. But if you listen to the old guards talk, you'll hear a different explanation. They say that Alcatraz wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the men themselves, by the pieces of their identities they had to abandon just to survive. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, you might consider this. In a place built to break the spirit, the smallest acts of defiance became victories. A whispered name, a smuggled letter, a memory that refused to fade. These were the rebellions no inspection could stamp out. These were the proofs that even in the most controlled environment imaginable, something human persisted. Something that no guard, no wall, no search could erase. And so the day ends and the lights dim once again. You roll onto your side and listen to the hush settling over the cell block. For a few hours at least your thoughts are your own, and in this small mercy you find the strength to face another dawn. The dawn on Alcatraz was always the same thin light filtering through the narrow slit of your window. A siren somewhere in the city beyond the water, the hollow footsteps of a guard making his first rounds. But this morning something feels different. Perhaps it's the memory of yesterday's inspection still raw in your mind, or maybe it's the knowledge that another day of exacting routine waits for you. Either way, you're already tired before your feet touch the cold concrete floor. Today you will spend hours in what was called the yard, the outdoor recreation area that many inmates both dreaded and craved. The yard was the only place you could see the sky in full. It was a rectangle of cracked pavement encircled by high walls topped with cyclone fencing and watchtowers. Here you could walk in circles, play a game of baseball, or simply stand near the edge and look out over the bay. On clear days the view was so vivid it almost seemed cruel. You could see San Francisco shimmering in the sun, the buildings tiny and bright, the bridges stretched like ribbons across the water. For some men that glimpse of the world was a torment proof of how close freedom lay, and how impossibly far. More than one inmate claimed the worst punishment was not the isolation, but that daily reminder of what they'd lost. You might imagine that in the yard men found a measure of relaxation, but in truth it was simply another stage on which the theatre of control played out. Guards stood above with rifles at the ready. Every movement was watched. Every word could be reported. Prisoners learned to scan the yard with a kind of sixth sense, reading the tension in a man's shoulders, the way he shifted his weight, the flicker of his gaze. Because out here, a single misstep could mean violence. One day you see a man in a faded cap, someone whose name you don't know, pause in his slow circuit of the yard. He looks up at the city for a heartbeat too long. That's all it takes. A bigger man steps close, his voice low and hard. You can't hear what's said, but you recognise the posture: shoulder angled in chin, lifted hands, held just loose enough to strike. The man in the cap nods. His face is blank, but you see something collapse behind his eyes. Later you'll hear that he had been warned not to stare. That the yard was not a place for dreaming. Out here you kept your eyes low and your thoughts lower still. Still, the yard held its rituals. Some men gathered at the far end to play checkers on a makeshift board scratched into the concrete. Others formed a small circle to exercise push-ups, lunges, squats, and attempt to wrest control over a body otherwise claimed by confinement. And some simply walked round and round, tracing the same path as if it might eventually wear a groove deep enough to escape through. On particularly cold days, the wind off the bay would whip around the walls and steal your breath. You'd see men huddle against the lee side, their arms folded tight. No one ever complained aloud. Complaining was reserved for the private hours, for the times when the lights dimmed and the guards retreated, and you could whisper your misery to no one in particular. Yet even in the yard, small rebellions surfaced. A smuggled note passed palm to palm, a message carved into a hidden corner of the wall, a quiet exchange of contraband, a cigarette, a scrap of chocolate, a stub of pencil. These were gestures that in the world beyond Alcatraz would mean nothing. Here they were proof that men were still capable of choosing, of claiming a fragment of agency. The guards knew, of course. They knew that no amount of vigilance could stop every act of defiance, and so their power lay not in total control, but in reminding you that at any moment they could reclaim what you'd taken. Around midday you are herded back inside. You stand in line for a head count, your number called, your presence confirmed. This ritual happened multiple times a day, a steady drumbeat reminding you that you were never simply yourself. You were a number, an entry on a ledger, a body to be accounted for. When the count was finished, you were marched to the mess hall. Today's meal is exactly like the last stew bread, a cup of watery coffee. You eat quickly because the longer you linger, the more likely you are to become the focus of attention you do not want. After lunch comes work detail. Every inmate was assigned labour unless he was too ill or too dangerous to be trusted. Some worked in the laundry sorting piles of institutional linens under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Others spent hours in the tailor shop mending uniforms and sewing canvas sacks. A few men worked in the mat shop, a place notorious for the thick dust that coated your lungs and left a taste of old rope on your tongue. Work was compulsory, but some found comfort in it. When your hands were busy, your mind could drift somewhere safer. There were even men who grew skilled enough to take pride in their tasks. One inmate, known to everyone simply as Red, became so proficient in the shoe shop that guards would sometimes bring their own boots for him to repair. He never spoke of it, but you could see in the set of his shoulders that the work gave him something he'd lost purpose. But for most, labour was simply another form of control, a way to exhaust you, to drain the last sparks of resistance. When the final whistle sounded, you were lined up, searched again, and marched back to your cell. The hours between afternoon and lights out were the longest. You might read the same page of a book a dozen times, your eyes drifting as the shadows crept across the floor. Sometimes you would sit on the edge of your bunk and listen to the sounds of the prison settling around you. The rattle of keys, a cough in a distant cell, the muffled voice of a guard calling for backup somewhere you couldn't see. These were the hours when the reality of Alcatraz pressed in hardest, when you felt how small your life had become. But if you were lucky, you could hold on to one thought: that tomorrow would come, that the routine would repeat, and that in that repetition you might find a way to survive. This, more than anything, was the truth of life on the rock, not the violence or the cold or even the hunger, but the slow grinding of days into a sameness so complete it could strip the edges from your mind. And yet somewhere beneath the weight of it all you knew. The fact that you still felt it was proof that you had not yet surrendered. You were still here, and that on Alcatraz was no small victory. Night on Alcatraz always arrived with a certain finality. It was as if the island itself heaved a sigh when the last light in the mess hall clicked off. You could feel the hush settle in the hush, of men resigned to their small square of concrete and iron for another stretch of darkness. In your cell, the air felt cooler now. You might pull the thin woolen blanket up over your shoulders, though it never really kept out the damp. The walls seemed closer at night, the quiet deeper. Still, you weren't quite alone. If you listened closely, you could hear the other men breathing, shifting, coughing. A whole colony of exiles, each imprisoned in his own private cell, but all tethered by the invisible threads of mutual survival. Sometimes you wondered what the others were thinking. Was the man 2 doors down remembering the taste of a good steak, the warmth of a woman's hand? Was someone else planning an escape he would never dare attempt? More likely, they were all thinking the same thing you were: how to make it through another night. This was the hour when the stories rose. The stories were never official, never confirmed by any guard or warden, but everyone repeated them all the same. Like the legend of the man who had spent so long in solitary that he had forgotten how to speak, or the tale of the prisoner who claimed he could hear the music of San Francisco drifting across the bay on summer evenings, strains of piano and laughter, carried on the wind reminders of a life that had moved on without him. Some said the stories were inventions, a way to pass the endless time. Others insisted they were true, that Alcatraz had more ghosts than inmates. You never knew what to believe, but it hardly mattered, because in the dark even the most outlandish tale could feel as real as the cold metal of your bunk. One such story, repeated in whispers whenever the night stretched too long, was about the so-called ghost of cell 14D. 14D was part of the dreaded D block, the solitary confinement tier reserved for the most unruly prisoners. This was not merely isolation, it was deprivation, a sensory vacuum designed to grind down even the toughest spirits. The cells were tiny concrete boxes with a steel door that shut out nearly all light. When the guards closed you in, you lost track of day and night within hours. Prisoners called it the hole, though the official term was segregation. You were stripped of everything but your basic clothing and a thin mattress that was removed each morning. If you were lucky, you might be allowed a book to read, though many men soon found they could no longer concentrate on the words. In that darkness, the mind began to invent its own reality. Some claimed they could see glimmers of light on the walls or hear footsteps pacing just beyond the door. A few swore they heard whispers that were not their own thoughts. And then there was the legend of 14D. According to inmates who spent time in adjacent cells, a man was locked there after attacking a guard. He screamed that something was in the cell with him, a creature or a presence he couldn't describe. The guards dismissed it as hysteria. But the screaming went on all night. In the morning when they opened the door, he was dead. No marks on his body, no explanation that satisfied the official report. The file listed natural causes, but the men who had lain awake listening to his cries were certain it was something else. After that, few inmates wanted to be assigned to 14D. Even the guards were said to unlock that door with a special caution, as though something waited behind it still. You might scoff at the story in the daylight, but alone in your cell with nothing but your own heartbeat for company, you could almost feel the truth of it. It was just one of the many strange threads in the tapestry of Alcatraz. As the hours crept by, you'd try to find small comforts. Some men prayed whispering rote words that had lost their meaning but still gave shape to the dark. Others counted the cracks in the ceiling or recited the multiplication tables to keep their minds occupied. There were those who tapped out coded messages to neighbours, a morse of necessity that offered brief moments of connection. And there were men who simply lay still, letting their thoughts drift like flotsam. You learned that time could stretch or contract in strange ways here. A single minute could feel like an hour if you let yourself dwell on it, so you didn't. You focused on your breathing, the slow rise and fall of your chest, the quiet rhythms that belonged only to you. When your thoughts slipped, they usually found their way to escape. Everyone thought about it eventually. It was almost a requirement of life on the rock to imagine at least once the impossible route back to freedom. Most men knew better than to try, but a few had. You remembered the story of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, perhaps the most famous escapees of all. In 1962, they had used makeshift drills to widen the vent openings in their cells. At night, they placed dummy heads crafted from soap and painted flesh-toned with stolen art supplies on their pillows. While the guards made their rounds, the real men crawled through the vents, climbed the plumbing system and emerged onto the roof. From there they descended and set out across the water on a raft pieced together from raincoats. No one knew for sure what became of them. The official report said they drowned, but some inmates believed they made it to freedom, that they were out there somewhere living under new names. The thought was both comforting and infuriating. Comforting because it proved escape was possible, infuriating because you were still here. On nights like this, you might close your eyes and picture them gliding across the moonlit water. You imagined what that first breath of freedom must have felt like, what it must have been to see the city lights not as a taunt, but as a promise. And then you opened your eyes and the cell was still the same narrow bunk, the same cold walls, the same knowledge that morning would come, and with it the routine you knew by heart. And yet in that imagining you felt something stir, a reminder that however strong the bars and high the walls, no prison could claim all of you. Some small part remained untouchable, and it was that part, your ability to dream, to hope, to remember that Alcatraz could never entirely crush. You held on to that as the night finally began to slip into dawn, the first grey light leaking through the bars. You had survived another night, and for now that was enough. Dawn on Alcatraz did not so much arrive as creep in by degrees. A pallid light seeped through the barred windows, revealing the drab geometry of cells and tiers. You could always tell who had slept and who hadn't by the look in their eyes, some dull with fatigue, others darting nervously as if the shadows hadn't entirely left. The guards began their rounds at the same time every morning. A clanging bell announced that it was time to rise, to fold your blanket with military precision, to stand by the bars and wait. The ritual was as rigid as any religious observance, and just as full of unspoken rules. There were men who moved briskly, eager to prove they were no trouble. There were others who lingered on the edge of defiance, delaying just long enough to force a guard to bark a second command. You might think you'd know which kind you'd be, but Alcatraz had a way of remaking everyone. Even the most stubborn spirits learned eventually that resistance came with a price. After roll call, the day began in earnest. Breakfast was served in the mess hall, a space that seemed almost cheerful when empty, though it turned oppressive as soon as hundreds of inmates filed in. The tables were bolted to the floor and each man had a designated seat. You learned quickly not to make eye contact with the wrong person. The menu rarely changed. Oatmeal that tasted vaguely metallic, toast so dry it dissolved into crumbs if you weren't careful. Sometimes a single shriveled piece of fruit as a gesture toward nutrition. Still no one lingered over the meal. The mess hall was also the site of some of the most violent episodes in the prison's history. Everyone knew it took only a few seconds for a disagreement to ignite into something worse. That knowledge hung over every meal like a film no amount of scrubbing could remove. One morning, as you sat with your tray balanced on the table's edge, you remembered hearing about the Battle of Alcatraz. It had happened in May of 1946, long before you ever arrived. 3 prisoners, Coy, Kretzer and Hubbard, had hatched a plan to seize the weapons room. They believed they could hold the guards hostage, force the warden to open the gates, and escape to the mainland. The plan began with precision. They overpowered the guards who controlled the gun gallery and armed themselves with rifles and pistols. But almost immediately it started to unravel. The keys they needed to open the yard door were missing, hidden by a quick-thinking guard before he was subdued. Without access to the yard, the escape route collapsed. For nearly 2 days, the 3 men held the cell block in a tense standoff. Gunfire echoed in the corridors. Guards crouched behind steel doors, returning fire when they could. Smoke and tear gas filled the air. When the Marines were finally called in to end the siege, 2 guards were dead. So were Coy and Kretzer. The 3rd man, Hubbard, was later executed for his part in the uprising. In the aftermath, the prison tightened its procedures even further. More counts, more inspections, more rules that no one dared question. You'd heard some inmates say the real legacy of the Battle of Alcatraz wasn't just the deaths, it was the atmosphere of perpetual vigilance it left behind. Everyone was on edge all the time. Back in the present, the clang of a metal tray being dropped snapped you from your thoughts. The guard shouted and the line moved forward again. After breakfast came work assignments. For some, this meant the laundry, a cavernous space filled with the hiss of steam presses and the sour smell of damp cloth. For others, it meant the glove shop, where rows of men stitched leather under the watchful eye of supervisors. There were a few lucky ones who got outdoor work, tending the gardens or painting buildings. You weren't one of them. Your job was in the library, shelving books returned by men whose appetite for reading came and went with their moods. Some days you relished the quiet. The ordered rows of volumes, the soft hush of pages turning, it was almost enough to make you forget where you were. But even here reminders intruded. Every book was stamped with the Alcatraz property seal. Every shelf was watched by the guard at the desk near the door. You could read anything you liked, but you could never forget that you were not free to leave. Some men used the library as a refuge, others as a weapon. You'd heard about Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz. Stroud had been here decades before, and though he wasn't actually allowed to keep birds on the rock, he'd spent years immersed in books studying ornithology. He wrote a massive manuscript on bird diseases that was eventually published. Some said he did it to keep his sanity. Others thought it was just another form of manipulation. Stroud was notorious for bending the rules to suit his purposes. Either way, his story was a reminder that even in a place designed to break men down, the mind could still carve out its own territory. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to bake the exercise yard. Men shuffled in circles, heads down each step, marking time. You joined them when your shift ended, not because you cared for exercise, but because being alone in your cell was worse. Out here you could feel the salt wind on your face, watch the seagulls wheel overhead. For a few minutes you could almost pretend you were anywhere else. The yard was also the only place you ever heard real laughter. Not often, and never for long. But every now and then a joke would slip past the walls men built around themselves, and for a heartbeat, you were all just human beings, not numbers. In the afternoons, the routine repeated head counts, work details, more counts. The monotony was part of the design. No surprises meant no chances for trouble, but monotony could be its own kind of torment. The men who struggled most weren't necessarily the ones who had committed the worst crimes. They were the ones who couldn't abide the sameness, the ones who needed change to feel alive. For them, the endless repetition was like a slow suffocation. As the day wound down, you felt the familiar mix of relief and dread. Relief that you'd survived another set of hours without incident. Dread that tomorrow would be exactly the same. Evening brought dinner, another procession of trays and murmured conversations, and finally the return to your cell. You watched the last light fade from the sky, leaving only the cold glow of electric bulbs. Somewhere far across the water, the city pulsed with life, music, laughter, the unremarkable miracles of ordinary freedom. But here night was the same as every other night, and you were still here, still waiting, still dreaming. Because no matter how many walls were built around you, there was always that small persistent hope that someday, somehow you would walk out into the air and never look back. Night on Alcatraz came slowly. It always felt as if the last rays of light were reluctant to leave, as though even the sun hesitated to abandon the island to darkness. From your bunk you could watch the soft glow fade beyond the bars, giving way to the sallow electric lamps that never went out. The cell block settled into its evening rhythms, muted voices drifting between the tiers, the occasional cough, the scrape of someone shifting on a thin mattress. You knew every sound by heart, and still each night felt just a little different, a little longer. They said the nights were when the place did its real work on a man. Daytime was all routines and regulations structured at least, but in the dark there were no distractions left. That was when the questions crept in. How much of yourself had you lost here? How much more would you lose before you finally walked free or didn't? Some men passed the hours reading whatever books they could find. Others played endless games of solitaire worn cards slapping gently on the shelf they used as a table. You had your own rituals. You tried to picture the city across the bay alive with lights and laughter you could only imagine. You tried to remember the feel of grass under your feet, the sound of a door opening that wasn't made of steel. Other times you found yourself thinking about escape, no matter how pointless the exercise seemed. Because if Alcatraz was famous for anything beyond its harsh discipline, it was for the certainty repeated in every newspaper article, every guidebook, that no one had ever successfully escaped. Officially, the record was perfect. Unofficially, that record was a little more complicated. You knew the story everyone liked to tell, the 1962 escape attempt that almost became legend. 3 men, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers John and Clarence, who spent months preparing the most audacious breakout the prison had ever seen. They were not what most would call model inmates. Morris was smart IQ, reportedly above 130, and a veteran escape artist. The Anglins were career bank robbers, their brotherhood a bond as strong as any ideology. The plan started with spoons stolen from the mess hall. With those spoons and a homemade drill, they widened the ventilation ducts behind their sinks, hiding the damage with painted cardboard when guards made inspections. At night, while the rest of the block slept, they worked in shifts, chipping away the concrete bit by bit. Some guards said later that they'd noticed strange noises, but assumed it was just the old plumbing groaning in the walls. When the openings were finally big enough, the men crawled into the utility corridor behind the cells, a space never meant to be accessed except by maintenance workers. There they set up a makeshift workshop. They stitched together a raft and life vests out of over 50 raincoats stolen or scrounged over months. They rigged a small bellows to seal the seams with heat, a detail so ingenious it almost seemed like fiction. And the final touch, papier-mâché dummy heads complete with human hair scavenged from the barbershop. On the night of June 11th, 1962, they left the decoys in their bunks, slipped through the holes, climbed up the pipes to the roof, and vanished into the dark. By the time the guards discovered the ruse, the men were gone. The search that followed was massive. Boats scoured the bay, helicopters hovered over the water, every roadblock in Marin and San Francisco was manned. The official line was clear: the men had drowned. The currents were too strong, the water too cold. No one could have survived. And yet, in the years that followed, rumours multiplied like fish in a tide pool. Someone claimed to have seen the Anglins in Brazil living under assumed names. A woman insisted she received a postcard she was certain had been sent by Frank Morris himself. The FBI closed the case in 1979 with no definitive answers, but the files are still thick with letters, sightings, theories. Even now, decades later, no one can say with certainty what became of them. Sitting in your cell, you thought about that often. Whether it was true or not hardly mattered. The possibility was enough, a tiny crack in the myth of Alcatraz's infallibility. Enough to keep you wondering if they could do it, maybe so could you. And then you'd look around at the reality. The bars, the steel mesh, the catwalks, and feel that familiar heaviness settle in your chest. Some men claimed they never thought about escape. You never quite believed them. It was human nature to imagine another life, even if only in dreams. The guards knew it too. That's why they counted you so often, morning, afternoon, evening again before midnight. They counted because they knew everyone was always thinking about how to leave. The rest of the night passed slowly. At intervals, a flashlight beam swept across your bunk, catching the dull gleam of your eyes, before moving on. A reminder no matter how quiet it got, you were never unobserved. Sometime after midnight you heard a soft tapping from the cell to your left. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. You knew the code, a question. You tapped back, "I'm here." It was nothing really a ritual like any other, but in that small exchange you felt the invisible thread that connected you to the others. Not friendship exactly. Something simpler proof that you were not entirely alone. Morning would come again, and with it the same routines. The same tired faces, the same unchanging schedule. But for now, in the hush of the cell block, you allowed yourself to imagine a different ending to the story. One where you slipped through the bars, out across the dark water, and into a life no one here could predict. And in that imagining you found a fragile kind of peace. At sunrise, Alcatraz was never quiet. The first clang of the morning bell reverberated through every cell like a physical force, shaking the last shreds of sleep from your body. Even if you'd managed to drift into a dream, maybe about the freedom of the mainland, maybe about nothing at all, it was gone in an instant. You sat up slowly, careful not to jostle the thin mattress more than necessary. The men around you did the same. There was no reason to rush. You'd learned quickly that haste was pointless here. Breakfast wasn't going anywhere, and neither were you. The guards moved down the tiers in pairs, checking locks and counting heads. Again. You wondered if they ever tired of the ritual, or if they drew some private satisfaction from it, the quiet reassurance that they were in control. Eventually the doors rattled open. One by one you stepped out and filed toward the mess hall, feet shuffling in a cadence everyone knew by heart. Breakfast was powdered eggs, oatmeal, and a slab of toast you could have used as a building material. Nobody complained out loud. Complaints were useless currency in Alcatraz. Instead, you ate in silence, eyes on your tray ears, tuned to the rhythm of utensils scraping against metal. From time to time, you risked a glance around the room. Some men looked the way you felt, thin, pale, hollow-eyed. Others seemed unchanged, as if the place hadn't touched them at all. You never decided whether they were stronger or simply better liars. After breakfast, you returned to your cell for inspection. The guards searched everything, turned out your pockets lifted, your mattress, ran gloved hands along the edges of the bunk. It didn't matter how many times they searched. They always found a reason to search again. When they were satisfied, you were marched out into the yard. The yard was Alcatraz's paradox, its promise of fresh air, a privilege that felt like punishment in disguise. Out here you could see the Golden Gate Bridge rising on the horizon. You could smell the salt tang of the bay. But you could also feel just how close you were to the world you'd lost. Some men walked in slow circles, hands in pockets. Others clustered in tight groups, talking in low voices. Occasionally laughter rose above the hush, a sharp, unexpected sound that vanished as quickly as it came. You wondered what it meant to still laugh here. Maybe it was a kind of defiance, a way to remind yourself you hadn't entirely surrendered. You tried to picture the tourists who'd someday sail past this place in bright boats, snapping photos of these walls. You could almost hear them. Can you believe people actually lived there? As if you were a curiosity in a museum exhibit, an artifact of punishment they could safely pity and then forget. But for now the yard was yours. You closed your eyes, letting the cold wind cut across your face. For one moment you pretended you were standing on any other piece of ground. Not an island, not a prison, just a place where a man could breathe. Then the whistle blew, and you were herded back inside. The rest of the day blurred into the same sequence you'd learned to expect. Work, detail, roll call, lunch. More work, more counting. In the workshop you sanded furniture bound for government offices. Each plank of wood felt the same under your palms, smooth, splinterless, indifferent. Some prisoners found comfort in the repetition. You tried, but most days it only made you feel smaller, as if you were disappearing into the hours. At supper you noticed a new man at the end of your table. He looked young, too young for this place. His hands trembled as he picked at the overcooked vegetables. Someone asked what he was in for. He didn't answer. You knew better than to press. By the time you returned to your cell, darkness was falling again. The guards slid past, locking each door in turn. That was when the real quiet came, the quiet that was heavier than any noise. You lay on your bunk, hands folded across your chest, staring at the ceiling until your eyes blurred. Some nights you thought about how many others had stared at the same cracks in the plaster. Bank robbers, killers, men who'd defied every law they'd ever met. Men who'd tried to swim for it and vanished. Men who died here in rooms just like this one. You weren't sentimental, but you felt it anyway, the weight of all those vanished lives pressing in from every side. As the hours stretched on, you began to understand why some historians called Alcatraz an experiment as much as a prison. An experiment in total control. An experiment in whether a man could be broken without laying a hand on him. The official records described it as necessary. A fortress for the worst of the worst. But in the silence you wondered if that was the whole truth. Because whatever you'd done to get here, the walls didn't care. They didn't care whether you'd killed a dozen men or stolen a handful of coins. They would hold you just the same. And in the end, that was what made Alcatraz unforgettable. Not the violence, not even the impossibility of escape, but the way it flattened everything about you until all that remained was a number on a roster and the steady throb of your own thoughts. On nights like this, you could almost feel the generations layered here, the stories you'd never hear, the last words no one recorded. You closed your eyes and tried to picture the day you would leave, the day your name would be called for the final time. It was a small hope, and it was all you had. In the hush that settled over the cell block, you held onto it like a lifeline. And somewhere beyond the bay, the city lights shimmered against the dark, waiting for a dawn you might one day see again. As you let your breathing slow, imagine that final image of the prison dissolving like a dream at dawn. The cold walls soften in your mind, the echo of footsteps growing fainter until they are no more than a distant memory. You have travelled through decades of stories tonight, glimpsing shadows behind bars, listening to the murmured regrets of men and women who lived their entire lives confined by stone and steel. Now, all those voices can fade into the quiet around you. There is no need to hold on to the details any longer. You can release them one by one like small paper boats drifting down a dark canal. Feel the heaviness slip away from your thoughts. Let the darkness around you become gentle, like a thick blanket pulled up around your shoulders. If you're still awake, you might notice how your eyelids have grown heavy, how each breath seems to carry you further from the noise of the day. This is your time to rest free from the stories of punishment and escape. You are safe here in this simple space where nothing more is asked of you than to be still. If you wish, you can return to this place again whenever you feel the pull of old histories, or simply want a quiet companion to keep you company in the night. For now, you have heard enough. You have done enough. Allow yourself to drift without hurry into whatever dreams are waiting. May the hush of this moment follow you gently into sleep. You're not alone. You're exactly where you need to be. Thank you for listening to the video. Now take a deep breath, relax your body and start getting a good night's sleep.